Shocking twist. Parents realize their son is a wanted killer. Hook. What if your own child was accused of a crime they didn't commit? Can a father's love be enough to uncover the truth? In this heart-pounding true crime story, a father goes to the darkest corners to clear his son's name. Will he find the real killer before it's too late? Stay with us till the end to discover the shocking twist that will leave you speechless. The air was thick with tension as the sun dipped behind the mountains. Inside the small, quiet house, the only sound was the steady tick of the clock on the wall. A mother stood in the kitchen, stirring a pot of soup. Her son, Jirapat, sat at the table, staring into the distance. He hadn't said a word for hours. His eyes, usually bright with energy, now seemed dull, distant. His father, Somchai, entered the room with a troubled look. There was a shift in the air, a coldness. "Did you hear the news?" Somchai asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Jirapat didn't respond. The television in the corner of the room flashed a breaking news story. A photo of a young man appeared on the screen. The headline read, "Wanted, killer behind Lori Show murder case." Somchai's heart skipped a beat as he stared at the face. It was his son. Jirapat's name was splashed across the screen. His heart raced. Jirapat looked up slowly, meeting his father's eyes. His face was pale. He looked like a stranger. "I didn't do it, Dad," Jirapat said, his voice hoarse. Somchai's mouth went dry. The weight of the words felt like a brick on his chest. "You need to tell me what happened," Somchai whispered. Jirapat hesitated, his hands trembling slightly. The room felt smaller, closing in around them. "I don't remember," Jirapat said, barely audible. The mother, who had been silent until now, turned towards them. Her hands froze mid-motion, the spoon still in the air. Her eyes widened with disbelief. "Jirapat, what are you talking about?" she gasped. The truth hung in the air like smoke. Somchai felt a wave of nausea wash over him. Could his son really be capable of something so terrible? The news anchor continued, describing the brutal details of the crime. Lori Show, a famous TV host, had been found murdered in her own home. The killer had left no trace, except for a blood-stained letter. The name Jirapat was written in the blood. The house felt colder now. Somchai's mind raced. He reached for the phone, dialing the number he knew he couldn't avoid. Jirapat remained silent. The truth was a weight he wasn't ready to carry. The phone rang, each second stretching longer than the last. Somchai's grip tightened around the receiver. Jirapat stood up, pacing slowly across the room. His steps were heavy, as if every movement cost him something. The tension between father and son grew thicker with each passing second. The voice on the other end of the line was sharp. "Detective Chai speaking," it said. Somchai's heart skipped a beat. "This is Somchai, Jirapat's father," he said, his voice trembling. There was a long pause. The detective's voice came back, low and grave. "We've been trying to reach you. Your son's name is on the suspect list for the murder of Lori Show." The words hit like a punch to the gut. Somchai couldn't breathe. Jirapat stopped pacing, staring at the ground, his face contorted in pain. "I didn't do it," Jirapat repeated, his voice barely more than a whisper. Somchai turned to him, his eyes searching for something, anything, that might explain this nightmare. "What did you do, Jirapat?" he asked, his voice breaking. Jirapat's face twisted with emotion, as if he were fighting an inner battle. "I don't know," he whispered, his hands clenched at his sides. The detective's voice came through again, more urgent. "We need to speak with him. He's the only lead we have." The words seemed to echo in Somchai's head. Jirapat was their only lead. Was he the killer? The walls seemed to close in even further. Somchai felt his knees buckle, but he caught himself on the table. "Please," the detective urged. "Bring him to the station immediately. Time is running out." Somchai ended the call. He turned back to his son, who was now sitting, hands trembling in his lap. Somchai felt a mixture of fear and disbelief. How could this be happening? His son was innocent, wasn't he? But the evidence, the name written in blood, it was all too real. Jirapat, Somchai began, his voice cracking. I don't know what's happening, Dad. Jirapat's eyes were wide, haunted. Somchai's mind raced. He had to make a decision. But the weight of the truth was suffocating. Jirapat, Somchai said again, his voice full of anguish. Tell me everything. Now. Jirapat swallowed hard, his chest rising and falling with each breath. His hands trembled in his lap, the fingers twitching involuntarily. I don't remember, Dad. I swear, I don't remember anything. The words sounded so empty, so hollow. But Somchai could see the pain in his eyes. It wasn't a lie. The house seemed to shrink around them, suffocating in the silence. His wife, still frozen in the doorway, hadn't moved a muscle. Somchai felt his heart breaking, piece by piece. How could this be? His own son, a murderer? The detective's words echoed in his mind. Time is running out. The longer they waited, the more dangerous the situation became. The police would come for him if they didn't act fast. Somchai stepped forward, his voice shaking. We need to go to the police station now, Jirapat. They'll have answers. Jirapat looked up at him, his eyes wild with panic. They won't believe me, Dad. They won't believe I didn't do it. His voice cracked with the weight of his fear. Somchai could feel the rawness of his son's pain, but there was no time for comfort. The truth, whatever it was, needed to come out. But what if Jirapat had done it and couldn't remember? What if the boy standing before him wasn't the same one he'd raised? Somchai grabbed his coat from the hook by the door. Come on, Jirapat. We have no choice. They needed to go before the situation got worse. Jirapat stood slowly, his knees weak. He looked toward his mother, who still hadn't spoken. She was staring at him, her face pale and drawn. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she didn't move. Somchai glanced at her, his heart heavy. I'll call the station, she said softly. The words felt distant, far away. Somchai nodded. He didn't know if it was fear or something else that gripped him now, but he couldn't stay here any longer. Jirapat moved slowly, almost in a trance, following his father to the door. The night outside was dark, colder than usual, as though the world was holding its breath. Somchai could feel it, the weight of what was to come. His son was in danger, and he was helpless to stop it. The door shut behind them, the quiet of the house, now a distant memory. The sound of their footsteps was all that filled the air as they walked down the quiet street toward the car. Somchai's mind was a blur. What had really happened to Lori Shou? And where was the truth hidden in his son's fractured memory? They reached the car, and Somchai felt the cold metal of the door as he opened it. Get in, Jirapat. Jirapat hesitated, his hand resting on the door handle. Dad. What? Somchai snapped, the fear in his voice betraying him. I can't remember, but I feel like I'm forgetting something important. Somchai froze. What did that mean? Jirapat's words lingered in the air, thick with unease. I feel like there's something I should know, he whispered almost to himself. Somchai's heart beat faster. What do you mean? He asked, his voice barely a whisper. Jirapat looked up at him, his eyes wide with confusion. I don't know, but every time I try to remember, it slips away. Somchai felt a cold shiver run down his spine. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. He could feel it in his bones. But there was no time to dig deeper now. They had to get to the police before it was too late. Somchai nodded, trying to steady his racing thoughts. Get in the car, Jirapat. We'll figure this out. I promise. Jirapat nodded, his expression distant. He opened the door and slid into the passenger seat, staring ahead. Somchai climbed into the driver's seat, but he couldn't shake the feeling that they were running toward something they weren't prepared for. The engine roared to life, breaking the silence. Somchai drove through the empty streets, the headlights cutting through the darkness like a knife. The town felt unnervingly still, like the calm before a storm. Jirapat stared out the window, his face expressionless. Somchai's mind raced. What was his son hiding? Was it the trauma of the murder? Was that why he couldn't remember? Or was there something more? Something sinister lurking in the depths of his mind? Suddenly, Jirapat spoke again, his voice strained. I don't think they're telling us everything, Dad. The police, they know more than they're saying. Somchai glanced at him, his grip tightening on the wheel. What do you mean? Jirapat's eyes met his, dark with fear. I feel like I'm being watched. Like they know something I don't. The words made Somchai's skin crawl. Was it possible? Was someone manipulating his son? Or worse, was Jirapat part of something much bigger? The silence between them was suffocating as the car sped toward the police station. The station loomed ahead, its lights casting long shadows on the pavement. Somchai parked the car, his hands shaking as he turned off the engine. They were here, but something told him the nightmare was only just beginning. Jirapat opened the door slowly, his movements stiff. Somchai hesitated for a moment, his eyes scanning the darkened street. A cold gust of wind blew through the air, carrying with it a sense of dread. Let's go, Somchai said, his voice low. They walked toward the entrance of the station, the sound of their footsteps echoing in the night. The door swung open with a soft creak. Inside, the fluorescent lights flickered above, casting an eerie glow across the room. Detective Chai was waiting for them. His expression was grim as he motioned for them to sit. Somchai's heart raced. What would they uncover here? The detective spoke without wasting a moment. Jirapat, we have some questions. The room felt colder now. The truth was closing in, and they weren't ready for it. Jirapat hesitated, glancing at his father with a look that spoke volumes, fear, confusion, and a sense of helplessness. Somchai could feel his own heart thudding in his chest. The detective's gaze was steady, almost cold. I need you to be honest with me, Jirapat, Detective Chai said, his voice sharp, yet measured. Jirapat sat down slowly, his fingers clenched tightly in his lap. I've already told you everything I know, he replied, his voice trembling. The detective didn't break eye contact. You remember nothing about that night? He asked. Jirapat swallowed hard, his throat dry. I don't, he whispered. Somchai sat beside him, unable to look away from the detective. The tension in the room was unbearable, thick like smoke. Detective Chai leaned forward, his hands resting on the table, the flickering light casting shadows across his face. There's something you're not telling us. We know you were there, Jirapat. We have your prints, your DNA. Jirapat's face drained of color. No, that's not possible, he gasped. Somchai's heart skipped a beat. His son's fingerprints? His DNA? How was that possible if Jirapat didn't even remember the night? Why don't you try harder to remember, Jirapat? The detective continued, his voice growing darker. Think about it. Everything you've forgotten, it's important. Jirapat shook his head, his eyes wide with panic. I told you. I don't remember anything. I didn't do it. The desperation in his voice rang clear, but Somchai couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The detective stood up suddenly, making the small room feel even smaller. We'll see what the evidence says, he said flatly. Somchai felt a chill run through him. Evidence, the name written in blood. The pieces didn't fit together, and yet they were being pushed into a corner. Dad, Jirapat whispered, his voice barely audible. Somchai turned to his son. I feel like I'm going crazy. Every time I try to remember, it slips away, like someone's blocking it out. Somchai's heart ached, but fear clawed at him. Could it be possible? Could someone have erased Jirapat's memories? Stay strong, Jirapat, Somchai murmured, trying to keep his voice steady. Detective Chai returned to the table, his expression hard. Your son isn't just a witness, Somchai. He's our prime suspect. The words hit like a slap in the face. Somchai's breath caught in his throat. You're wrong, he said, his voice shaky. My son wouldn't do something like that. The detective's eyes narrowed. We'll see. Suddenly, the door opened behind them. Another officer stepped inside, holding a file in his hands. This just came in, the officer said, sliding the file across the table. Somchai's pulse quickened as the detective opened the file. He looked at the officer and then back at the contents of the file. His face darkened. This changes everything, Detective Chai muttered under his breath. Somchai leaned forward, a cold dread settling in his stomach. What is it? He asked, his voice shaking. Detective Chai didn't answer immediately. Instead, he pulled out a photograph from the file. The photo was of Jirapat, but there was something different about it. It wasn't a simple mugshot. In the photo, Jirapat was holding something that made Somchai's blood run cold. A knife. It was the same knife that had been used in Laurie Show's murder. The room felt like it was closing in on them. Somchai's mind raced. How was this possible? What did it mean? Jirapat stared at the photo, his face twisted in shock. I don't remember this, he said, his voice breaking. The detective's voice was cold. We found more than enough evidence, Jirapat. You're connected to the crime. The air in the room grew thick with tension. Somchai could feel his legs weakening, his vision blurring. Was this truly his son, the boy he had raised? Could he really be capable of such horror? The detective's next words were like a final blow. We're going to need you to come with us, Jirapat, for your own safety. Somchai's world seemed to crumble. The walls, the air, the very ground beneath him, all felt distant, as if they were fading away. What had happened to his son? Jirapat's eyes were wide with terror, his face pale as a ghost. He recoiled slightly, as if the words had physically struck him. I didn't do it. I swear, he cried, his voice rising in panic. Somchai felt his chest tighten. He reached out to his son, grabbing his trembling hands. Jirapat, listen to me. We'll figure this out. You don't have to go with them. We'll fight this. But deep down, Somchai knew that the more they resisted, the tighter the noose around them would get. The detective's gaze softened just slightly, but there was no mercy in it. Your son has already confessed to being present at the scene, Mr. Somchai. We have proof. Somchai's mind raced. Confessed? Jirapat hadn't said anything about confessing. Had the police twisted his words? Or worse, was it all part of something darker? Jirapat turned to his father, his voice barely a whisper. I don't remember. I didn't confess. They're lying. The detective's expression hardened. It doesn't matter what you remember now, Jirapat. The evidence is clear. We're taking you in. Somchai felt a cold wave of dread wash over him. His son was slipping further away from him, into the hands of the law, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. But then something inside him snapped. His love for Jirapat, his determination to protect him, it pushed him forward. No, Somchai said, his voice shaking but firm. He's not going anywhere. Not like this. The detective's eyes narrowed, clearly taken aback by the sudden defiance. You have no say in this, Mr. Somchai. Your son is a suspect, and until we get to the bottom of this, he stays with us. Somchai stood up quickly, his heart racing. I don't believe it, he said, his voice cracking. Something's wrong here. You've got it wrong. You have to look deeper. Jirapat looked up at his father, his face full of confusion and fear. Dad, I don't understand. Why are they doing this to me? Somchai wanted to scream, to punch through the walls of the room and rip apart the lies that were choking them. But he couldn't. The truth was slipping through his fingers like sand, and there was nothing he could grasp to hold onto. The detective was speaking again, his voice colder this time. Mr. Somchai, you're obstructing justice. You're not helping your son by doing this. The door to the room opened abruptly, and another officer stepped in. I need you to step back, sir, the officer said to Somchai. Somchai didn't move. Not until you tell me what's really going on here, he shouted. The officer's hand went to his belt, and for a moment, Somchai thought they might force him out. But then Detective Chai raised a hand, signaling for calm. Let him stay, he said, though his voice was laced with frustration. Somchai stood there, trembling with a mix of rage and helplessness. Jirapat was still sitting, his hands clenched, his eyes wide with fear. Please, he whispered, his voice shaking. I didn't do it. I don't remember anything, but I didn't kill her. I swear. The words echoed in the room, but they felt like they had no weight behind them. Everything about this was wrong. This wasn't his son. Or was it? Suddenly, the officer holding the file stepped forward again. There's something you should see, he said, opening it in front of Somchai. A new photograph was revealed. This one wasn't of Jirapat, but of a woman, Lori Sho. And in the background of the photo, there was something that made Somchai's blood freeze. A shadowy figure stood in the corner, barely visible, but unmistakable. The man in the picture was wearing the same jacket as Jirapat. It was unmistakable. Somchai felt his stomach drop. Wait, he began, his mind racing. That jacket. Jirapat doesn't own a jacket like that. But the detective cut him off. The jacket was found at the scene, Mr. Somchai, and Jirapat's fingerprints were all over it. Somchai turned to Jirapat, his hands trembling. He hadn't noticed before, but Jirapat was wearing the same jacket now. Was he losing his mind? Dad, Jirapat whispered, his voice fragile. I didn't do it. I swear I didn't. But the weight of the evidence was pressing in, suffocating everything else. How could he protect his son when the truth seemed so far out of reach? Somchai's hands gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles turning white. The world around him seemed to blur. Everything, the detective, the officers, the photographs, felt distant, unreal. His son was wearing that jacket, the one in the photo. But how? Why would Jirapat lie about something so obvious? Jirapat's voice broke through the storm of thoughts swirling in Somchai's mind. Dad, please, I didn't do it. I don't know how my fingerprints got there. I don't know how that jacket ended up at the scene. His son's voice was barely audible, full of panic and confusion. Somchai's chest tightened, his breath shallow. The detective's expression remained cold, unmoving. If he didn't do it, then why all the evidence? Detective Chai asked, his voice biting. Somchai turned toward him, his eyes wild. There has to be another explanation. You can't just... But the detective interrupted him. Mr. Somchai, the evidence speaks for itself. We found blood on the jacket. We found your son's fingerprints all over the crime scene. You need to face the truth. Somchai shook his head, his mind spinning. No, this isn't my son. Something isn't right. Jirapat's face crumpled in agony. I swear, Dad, I swear I didn't do it. I don't remember anything. I don't remember killing anyone. But the words sounded hollow, even to Somchai. His son was unraveling in front of him, and every moment that passed felt like a nail in the coffin of their lives. The detective stepped closer, his voice low but firm. We need you to come clean, Jirapat. There's still time to help yourself. Jirapat's eyes flicked toward Somchai, pleading, desperate. I'm telling you the truth. I don't remember. It's like someone else did it. Someone who's controlling me. The room seemed to grow colder with each word. Could Jirapat be right? Could someone have made him forget, taken control of his mind somehow? The idea was absurd, impossible even, yet Somchai couldn't shake the feeling that something deeper was at play here. He looked at Jirapat's face. His son was terrified. But if it wasn't Jirapat, then who? Somchai's mind raced, pulling at threads, desperate for answers. The detective wasn't letting up. Jirapat, there's no one else. It's just you. You were there. You killed Lori Sho. The words stung, each one like a slap. Jirapat shook his head violently, his face pale with terror. No. Please, I didn't do it. Somchai felt his heart break, the words shattering everything he had believed. Asterisk, was this his son? Or had someone else planted themselves inside his mind, slowly twisting him into something unrecognizable? Asterisk. His gaze flicked to the file again, then to the photograph. There had to be something, some clue, something that would explain this madness. I need to talk to him, Somchai said suddenly, his voice hoarse with desperation. The detective frowned. Talk to who? Talk to the woman, Somchai said, his voice trembling. Lori Sho. She's the key to all of this. The detective shook his head slowly. She's dead, Mr. Somchai. There's no talking to her. Somchai's heart sank. No, he said, his mind working furiously. We need to find out who she really was. She knew something. She was involved in something. But the detective was already shaking his head. You're grasping at straws, Mr. Somchai. The truth is in front of you. Your son is guilty, and that's the end of it. Somchai's hands were shaking, his mind a whirlwind of chaos. No. There's something you're missing, he whispered, more to himself than anyone else. Jirapat's eyes were wide, his body trembling with fear. Dad, please. I don't want to go to jail. I didn't do it. Somchai leaned over, his voice steadying as he looked into his son's eyes. Jirapat, listen to me. I believe you. For a moment, everything else fell away. The noise of the room, the detective's cold words, the overwhelming evidence. None of it mattered. Somchai's mind was focused on one thing, and one thing only, his son's innocence. They were being pushed into a corner, and Somchai refused to let them be trapped by lies. I will find the truth, he whispered, his voice firm with conviction. Dad, what if I can't remember? Jirapat's voice was barely above a whisper. Somchai's heart clenched. What if Jirapat didn't remember? But the truth, somewhere deep in his gut, told him that this was far from over. Somchai's mind was spinning, the weight of his son's words heavy in the air. What if Jirapat didn't remember? He needed to find the missing pieces, the things that didn't add up, the pieces that the detective wasn't looking for. Somchai stood up abruptly, the urgency within him rising like a tidal wave. Detective Chai, he said, his voice firm despite the chaos inside him. The detective glanced up, his gaze cool and uninterested. What is it now, Mr. Somchai? I want to see the crime scene photos. All of them. The ones you didn't show me, Somchai said, his voice low. The detective's brow furrowed. You've seen the photos that matter. No, Somchai said, his voice gaining strength. You're missing something. I need to see them all. For a long moment, the room was silent. Jirapat looked up at his father, a silent plea in his eyes. Somchai felt a strange pull, an instinct that told him there was something hidden in those photos, something crucial. The detective finally sighed, clearly irritated, but nodded toward the officer who had brought the file in earlier. Get the rest of the photos. Let him see what he wants. Somchai barely noticed, the officer leaving the room, his focus entirely on Jirapat. I'm not leaving here without the truth, Somchai said quietly, almost to himself. Jirapat stared at him, his eyes filled with fear and confusion. But what if the truth? What if it's too late, Dad? Jirapat whispered. Somchai reached out, gently placing a hand on his son's trembling shoulder. No, he said, his voice steady. It's never too late. Moments later, the officer returned with a thick stack of photographs. He placed them on the table in front of Somchai, his face stoic. The photographs were haunting, each one more unsettling than the last. But Somchai's eyes searched each image with laser focus. He flipped through them quickly at first, each one depicting a different angle of the crime scene, the body of Laurie Sho lying in a pool of blood. But then one photograph caught his attention. It wasn't the body this time. It was something else, something much smaller in the frame. In the corner, just by the door, there was a shadow, a figure. It was faint, almost impossible to see, but it was there. Somkai's breath hitched. It wasn't Jirapat. The figure wasn't wearing the same jacket, nor did it match Jirapat's height or build. Somkai's fingers shook as he zoomed in on the shadow, his heart pounding. This was it. This was the missing piece. "Wait," Somchai said, his voice barely a whisper. "Who is this?" The detective stepped over, looking at the photograph with mild disinterest. "That's just a shadow, Mr. Somchai. Nothing more." But Somchai was insistent. "No. Look again. This is someone else. Someone who was there." The detective narrowed his eyes, then leaned in for a closer look. Somkai's pulse raced. Who was that? Why hadn't the police investigated it before? "I don't know," Detective Chai muttered, sounding uncertain for the first time. Somkai's fingers hovered over the photo, his mind racing. Who could it be? The shadows weren't enough, not yet, but they were a start. Jirapat looked up at his father, eyes wide with fear. "Dad, what are we doing?" he asked, his voice strained. Somchai turned to him, his face determined. "We're finding the truth, Jirapat. I'm not letting them take you like this. Not when I know there's more to the story." Jirapat shook his head, his lips trembling. "But how? We don't have anything. The police, they have everything. I don't know what happened. I don't know anything." Somchai felt his chest tighten with the weight of his son's words. "You don't have to know everything. You just have to trust me." For a moment, Somkai's gaze met the detective's, and something shifted in that moment, something that hinted at doubt in the detective's eyes. Maybe they hadn't uncovered everything. Maybe there was more to Laurie Sho's murder than they realized. Somchai gathered the photographs in his hands, his resolve hardening. "I'm going to find this person," he said, his voice steely. "And when I do, we'll have the answers." The detective watched him for a moment, then finally sighed. "This is pointless, Mr. Somchai. You're wasting time." But Somchai barely heard him. He was already lost in his thoughts, already thinking of the next steps. Finding that shadow, finding that figure who could hold the key to his son's innocence. As Somchai stood to leave, he turned to Jirapat. "We'll get through this. I promise. I won't let anyone take you away." Jirapat looked at him, his face full of fear, but also something else. "Hope. Dad, what if it's too late?" Somchai paused, feeling the weight of his son's question. What if it's too late for the truth? He couldn't answer that, not yet. But one thing was certain. He wasn't giving up. Not now. Not ever. Somkai's heart pounded as he stepped out of the room, the photographs heavy in his hands. The detective's voice, distant and dismissive, faded into the background. He wasn't listening anymore. His mind was focused on the shadow in that photograph. The figure that had to be important, that had to hold the key. He wasn't going to let his son be buried under a lie, not when there was a sliver of hope to cling to. As he stepped into the dimly lit hallway, Somkai's thoughts raced, pulling him in different directions. He knew he had to move fast, before the trail grew colder, before the police sealed up the case and declared Jirapat guilty. There was only one way to find out who that shadow belonged to. Somkai's eyes locked on Jirapat, sitting alone in the cold, sterile room, his expression both haunted and hopeful. His son needed him, but the time for questions was running out. Somchai made a decision. "I'm going to find that person," he muttered to himself, determined. His mind reeled, recalling anything he could about Laurie Sho's life. Who had she known? Who had she been close to? She was a public figure, but there had to be someone she had trusted, someone who would know what happened that night. Somchai reached for his phone, dialing a number that could lead him in the right direction. "Hello," a voice answered on the other end. Somchai's pulse quickened. "It's me. I need you to find out everything you can about Lori Sho. Her connections, her acquaintances, anyone who could have been with her before she died." The voice on the other end hesitated for a moment, but then spoke. "Somchai, you sure about this? The case is closed. The police they have your son." "I'm sure," Somchai replied, his voice firm. "I need to know everything. There's something here, something the police haven't seen." "All right, I'll look into it. But this is dangerous, Somchai." "I know," Somchai whispered, his mind flashing back to the dark figure in the photograph. "You just make sure you find something." "Anything," he said, and hung up. The silence that followed felt suffocating. Somchai turned and looked back at the interrogation room, his heart aching. Jirapat was still sitting there, his face pale, eyes hollow. Somchai couldn't shake the image of the shadow in the photo, the one he was certain had to be the key to everything. He would find out who that was. He would find out what really happened to Lori Sho. The truth, he felt, was out there, waiting to be uncovered. And no matter what it took, Somchai would stop at nothing to clear his son's name. But deep inside, a question gnawed at him. Asterisk, what if it was too late? What if Jirapat had already been caught in something he couldn't escape from? Asterisk. Somchai shook his head, forcing the thought away. He had no choice but to believe in his son's innocence. No matter how dark things got, no matter how twisted the truth might turn out to be, Somchai would fight until the end. And somewhere, buried in the lies and confusion, he would find the answers. He had to. For Jirapat, the night had fallen heavy and still, a blanket of silence wrapping the city in its cold grip. Somchai stood outside the police station, his breath visible in the frigid air. Every second that passed felt like an eternity. Jirapat's future was in the hands of a system that had already made up its mind. But Somchai wouldn't accept it. Not until he had proof, not until the truth was dragged into the light, no matter how deep it was buried. He glanced at the phone in his hand. The call he had made earlier to his contact had yielded nothing useful yet. But the absence of answers only made Somchai more determined. He wasn't going to let his son rot in a cell because of a mistake, or worse, a deliberate frame job. The phone buzzed in his hand. It was a message from his contact. A name. It was the last piece of the puzzle he hadn't expected to find. Somchai's eyes widened as he read the name. The connection to Lori Sho was deeper, darker than he had imagined. A man, an old acquaintance of Lori's, someone with a history of violence, someone who had been in the shadows of the case from the start. Somchai's stomach churned. It all made sense now. Lori Sho had been involved with him, tangled in something dangerous, something that had led to her death, and to Jirapat being dragged into it. With the name in hand, Somchai rushed to the address. His pulse was thumping in his ears as he pulled up to the rundown apartment building. This was it. The man who had orchestrated everything, who had used his son as a pawn in a game he couldn't even understand. Somchai moved quickly, his heart racing as he approached the building's entrance. Inside, the air was thick with tension. Every step he took echoed through the halls, until he reached the door to apartment 4B. He knocked hard. The door swung open almost immediately, revealing a man with a cold, calculating stare. Somchai's breath hitched. "I know what you did," Somchai said, his voice steady despite the storm inside him. The man smirked, but there was something in his eyes, something that said he wasn't as untouchable as he thought. "This ends now," Somchai added. The man's smirk faltered. Without warning, Somchai grabbed him by the collar, pulling him closer. "You used my son as a scapegoat, didn't you? You framed him for something he didn't do. You killed her." The man's face hardened. "You have no idea what you're talking about," he spat, but his eyes flickered with uncertainty. Somchai's grip tightened. "I know enough," he said, his voice low and dangerous. The man's defiance wavered. Suddenly, he seemed to realize that the game had changed. Somchai wasn't backing down. The man broke, his walls crumbling as he confessed. It was him. He had been the one to set everything in motion. Jirapat had been a pawn, a victim of manipulation and deceit. Somchai let go of the man's collar, his hands shaking. The truth had finally come to light. His son was innocent. As Somchai walked out of the building, the weight of the moment pressed on him. Jirapat was going to be freed, but the journey had cost them both everything. Somchai looked up at the night sky, feeling the cold wind cut through him. There was no victory here, only the harsh reality of what had been lost. But at least they had their future back. At least Jirapat would be free. Somchai whispered to himself, "We made it, son. We made it." And for the first time in what felt like forever, he allowed himself a breath of relief. The sun began to rise, casting a pale light across the city as Somchai stood outside the courthouse, his face weathered but resolute. The storm had passed. Inside, Jirapat's fate was being decided, but Somchai knew the truth was finally on their side. The man who had framed his son was behind bars, and the truth about Lori Show's death had been laid bare. Jirapat had been a victim of a twisted scheme, and now the world would know it. Somchai's mind replayed the moments that had led him here, the dark, frantic nights, the uncertainty, the fear that had gnawed at him every second. But now, as he waited, there was only a sense of quiet resolve. Jirapat would be free. The doors of the courthouse opened, and Somchai's heart skipped. Jirapat stepped out, his face pale, but his eyes full of something else. Hope. Somchai's breath caught in his throat. There had been a time when he thought he would never see this moment, never see his son stand in front of him with the weight of innocence finally restored. Jirapat's eyes locked with his father's, and for a moment, the world fell away. It was just them. Somchai's legs felt weak, but he stood tall. Jirapat approached, the silence stretching between them like a lifeline. "Dad." Jirapat's voice was soft, almost uncertain. Somchai took a step forward, pulling his son into a tight embrace. "I'm so sorry, son," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Jirapat clung to him, his tears hidden in the folds of his father's shirt. "It's not your fault," Jirapat said, his voice breaking. "I never wanted any of this. I didn't know what was happening." Somchai held him even tighter, not knowing what words could make it better. But as they stood there together, he realized that no words were needed. They had made it. The road had been long, filled with shadows and fears, but they had found the light in the end. And in this moment, with the past behind them, the future was wide open. Somchai pulled back, his eyes searching his son's face. "We'll be okay," Somchai said, his voice steady. Jirapat nodded, wiping away the remnants of tears. Together, they walked into the new dawn, side by side. The storm had passed, but the journey wasn't over. But for now, Somchai knew that they had won, and for the first time in a long time, they could breathe easy.